Thank you. I'm happy to talk about actually policies. In fact, that's all I'll basically talk about. Maybe it's because it's such a lovely sunny day here in Washington, or I have the luxury of not talking about one particular city or charter takeover situation. I'm going to focus on a broader question of, can we create a level playing field for traditional public schools and for charter schools? And by level playing field, I mean both that the charter schools and traditional public schools have similar circumstances to each other, and that the traditional public schools have similar circumstances as they would and resources as they would if the charter schools' growth hadn't occurred. So really what I'm going to do is dive a lot deeper into something David brought up in terms of when students switch from traditional public schools to charter schools, revenues go down for the traditional public schools, but costs also go down. And there's a question of how much do each of those decrease, how quickly do they decrease, what costs can be scaled back and which costs can't be scaled back, and what can policies do to ease the burden and to improve student performance and the likelihood of students performing well in both charter schools and traditional public schools. So although I'm not going to talk about any place in particular, I'm going to heavily draw on some lessons learned from some research studies. One study myself and Robert Baffucco of Syracuse University did, looking at some New York school districts, particularly Buffalo and Albany, and the fiscal impact of charter school growth in those areas on those public school districts. And also there's excellent recent research paper by Singleton and Ladd looking at North Carolina, both urban and rural districts in North Carolina. And I would love to say I could paint an even broader picture across the nation, but charter school policies and finance policies vary so much across states that you really can't generalize. You have to do these state-specific looks to see what's the fiscal impact on the traditional public school districts when you have charter school growth. So one big theme I want to highlight is that there's 4 different areas where traditional public school districts are affected when you have growth in charter school enrollments nearby. One issue is scale. So how efficiently can you operate at different sizes of scale and different sizes of enrollment? That's how many buildings you need, how many principals you need, issues like that. And this scale issue is only one of many issues affecting costs. It's not the issue, and it could go in various directions. So take some examples from these research studies, 2 cases. One case, Albany, New York. In Albany, New York, charter school growth at the middle school level, one could actually argue, helped Albany School District in terms of their middle school scale. Well, why? Because Albany School District had roughly 2.5 schools worth of middle school kids before charter growth. Then charter school enrollments grew, and then they have effectively 2 schools worth of middle schools, and it then becomes, would be a pragmatic decision to scale back from having 3 schools to 2 schools. So there actually, the scale, you could actually be advantageous to be at a different scale in that particular case. But then take a different example of Orange County, North Carolina, a very small non-urban district in North Carolina, where just the introduction of 2 charter schools and huge growth in charter school enrollments there made it very difficult for them to keep up and staff their existing schools in the same way as they used to. So those are very different situations, and you have to be careful. Just because you're worried about scale, bigger isn't always better. If that were the true case, then everyone concerned about charter schools' growth would also be petitioning New Jersey to consolidate. You have so many school districts in New Jersey. Why would you want so many school districts? We should start consolidating all of them, right? Because bigger is better. Or you would be arguing that we shouldn't have small schools because bigger is better and we want larger scale. So having smaller scale setups isn't always bad. It can be bad in some cases, or it can be helpful in some cases. But again, scale is only one of 4 issues that come up in terms of how traditional public school districts are affected when you have charter school growth. The other important issue is the transitional costs. And this is big because you can't overnight simply all of a sudden adjust all of your costs. Staffing, you might not know or quickly be able to reduce staff when you have a sudden loss of enrollment. Administrators, you again might or might not be able to immediately reduce those costs. And even when you can change the number of teachers you hired, that's imposing additional costs. So for example, a school district might just hire fewer new teachers, but of course new teachers tend to make far lower salaries than their veteran teachers. So it takes time, years, as basically attrition allows these districts to scale down. The cost savings in year one from scaling down for the school district are far, far less than they would be in years 4 or 5. And then, of course, unfortunately, some transitional costs you can't avoid. So if you have unfunded teacher pension commitments, if you have facilities costs where you've paid for it already, as David brought up a horrific example where you've paid for it and you aren't even using it now, but you have to keep paying for it, there's no transition that's going to get you out of that. But a lot of costs you can get out of in terms of the transition, but it just means in year one the costs are going to be a lot higher than 5 years down the line. So that's 2 of the 4 areas where charter school growth affects public school districts' finances. The third area, which isn't talked about directly enough, is instability. So traditional public school districts are, I like to call them the server of last resort. Just like some people worry about the federal government being the bank of last resort for failing banks. Well, public school districts are the service provider of last resort when you have failing charter school districts, and there can be a lot of instability. And in a way, there's a cost there because public schools have to provide some sort of insurance for these enrollment fluctuations, where if that's having excess capacity in terms of physical space, if that's not immediately laying off as many staff or again, slowing your hiring of staff and teachers, you have to have this excess capacity due to this instability in enrollments. And I'll talk about some easy but unfortunately as yet not pursued policy solutions to reduce a lot of those instability costs soon. The fourth issue is student composition. So the different types of students have different costs associated with them. Again, this gets complicated. The case of special education was brought up. Federal dollars for special ed often do follow the students as they go to charter schools, but often, of course, those finances aren't enough in many cases to serve students. So schools do sometimes have to have higher costs. So to the greater extent that charter schools are accepting students who are representative of the general population, that issue goes away, where the composition is similar between charter school students and traditional public schools. So those are the 4 areas. Now I want to talk about potential policies, things that both have been done and things that aren't being done that could be to solve these issues. In terms of transition costs, Massachusetts and New York are 2 states that do allow at least some additional funding for public school districts who are affected by charter school growth. So in the early years of charter school growth, public school districts do get some additional dollars. Some might argue that it's not enough money or that it doesn't go for far along enough, but those programs do exist. And I think in the recent debate over Massachusetts charter schools, with the expansion of the quota there, that policy got a little short thrift in discussion. It could just as easily a discussion of how many charter schools do we want to allow, or how quickly do we want growth. It could be how much do you compensate the public school districts for this medium-term time period where they can't make up the financial burden. In terms of instability, far more could be done to entice charter schools to have to enroll their students earlier. So if you have policies that require the charter schools to report to the traditional public schools which students they've signed up ahead of time, that makes it easy to coordinate and for the school district to plan and have a much better sense of how many students they're going to have to serve for the upcoming school year. Unfortunately, I'm I'd love to hear about one. I'm unaware of any policies that are either mandating or incentivizing that sort of coordination. And in terms of the general framework, what are we talking about here? What kind of financing system would we need to actually have a level playing field? Well, it might look like something like 80-20-20. Now, 80-20-20 doesn't add up to 100. And there's a reason it doesn't add up to 100, because having these two systems is going to impose additional costs. That's just inevitable. But if you have something like 80-20-20, where 80 is roughly the automatic percentage of revenues that go to the charter schools in terms of percentage of state and local operating revenues. Now, again, currently every state does it differently. There's hugely different percentages that go. Sometimes it's 100%, sometimes it's far less. But 80% as a baseline, meaning, and then the district automatically keeps roughly 20%. And then, well, what's the additional 20%? Well, that's going to have to be additional tax dollars raised and then redistributed. How could it be redistributed? Well, I'd pose a couple of suggested policies. Another problem with the level playing field is this idea that the traditional public school districts, they can't scale down their costs. They can't scale down things like existing pension costs. And yet often the charter schools don't necessarily receive help or funding or much funding for their facilities. And again, this often creates a relationship where we don't see much incentives for school districts and charter schools to partner with each other. Some people lament that public school districts and charter school districts aren't coordinating. Well, the incentives aren't always there. So I don't think it's necessarily that these are bad-willed people. The incentives aren't there. So one thing you could do with this extra 20% of tax dollars that you'd have to raise, is offer school districts, you can retain an additional 10% of the average state and local revenue spending across the statewide average if you are leasing your space to a charter school. This creates an incentive for school districts to recruit charter schools and offer mutually advantageous deals for space sharing. Why is that important? I'm not in love with the idea of, sometimes you hear of these cafeteria sharing where students have to eat their lunches way too early. I'm not necessarily in love with that. But why this could be a good policy is it reduces this instability cost. So again, the problem is if the charter school closes, the public school has to absorb those students. They can't all of a sudden say, oh, well, we did want a school. No, we don't want a school. We open a school. We have a bond issue. We're paying for years for a school. Oh, now it's vacant. Now it's vacant because we're downsizing. By creative incentives for space sharing or space leasing, it could be an entirely vacant building, otherwise vacant building from the school district, now leased to the charter school, you're reducing the instability. What other policies could you do to incentivize productive collaborations? As I mentioned before, usually the public school district finds out way too late, basically in September, who's showing up and how have enrollments changed and how much have they changed to the prior year, from the prior year. The charter schools should get a different percentage of funding depending on how early they sign a student up. So if they've signed up a student by, let's say, April of the prior school year and that student actually enrolls, they could get 85% equivalent. But if this is a student who suddenly shows up and hasn't been pre-registered in April, they might only get the 80% of revenue. That creates this incentive to have this coordinated enrollment system. And again, David was lamenting you have these two systems in Detroit. They're not coordinating with each other at all. That creates these financial incentives for the charter schools to report out to the traditional public schools. Okay, which students are switching over? Who are we enrolling? What are the numbers probably going to look like? And that way the superintendent and principals, they know, do we need to hire 8 new teachers this year or just 6 new teachers? They have much better information. What else could be done in terms of policies? Obviously, instability is going to be even bigger issue in states with little accountability, whether it's financial accountability or for performance accountability for charter schools. That's not someone could easily take up the whole panel's time talking about how states, this sort of trade-off. Charter schools, basically, it's supposed to be a trade-off, where charter schools get this extra freedom, this extra, fewer rules to follow, and that in response, they are held accountable to for their finances and for student well-being and performance. If states have stronger policies for actually holding charter schools accountable, you're going to lower instability costs to everyone. So again, the exact numbers don't matter. Maybe 80-20-20 isn't realistic, or the exact numbers you could argue with, but I'd argue that's getting it in the ballpark in terms of when you look at in terms of transition costs, that you're going to have to start providing school districts with roughly 20% of these students' revenue, especially in the first 1 to 4 years that students are newly attending charter schools in their communities. And what if the extra 20%, what if that's more than enough for these charter school incentive programs? Well, here's a proposal. Maybe it's not just because it's a beautiful day in Washington. Maybe I'm thinking along more political lines now. Well, part of the problem with this revenue sharing, as I mentioned before, is that the traditional publics have these existing pension commitments that are often underfunded. Wouldn't it be great if the additional tax dollars were a commitment to both funding these underfunded teacher pensions and incentivizing better collaborations between the charter schools and public school districts for coordination of services? So, for example, in places where you don't have take-up, where you don't have the public school districts getting bonuses to offer physical space to charter school students, use that money in the state to fund the deficit in teacher pension commitments. And as those deficits shrink, you're going to get a lot closer to a world where school districts don't necessarily have to lose 20%, have to keep 20% of their money when they lose a student. Why? Because their pension commitments are going down. Use that money to get rid of these longer-term structural deficits. So, and again, this is very much in the current news, and you hear about these debates over teacher salaries. Teacher salaries are a huge issue in states. In California, mental health services in schools are among the lowest of any state. And what's going to happen is, in all these states, as more and more of the dollars go to paying for pension commitments that have already been made, the school districts aren't getting to buy anything additional, so they're going to be shorting out these other areas. So really, by looking at this holistically, we're going to have to raise more tax dollars for these commitments we've already made, and for this idea of having a balanced playing field for both charters and traditional publics. Is it worth it? Is it worth raising additional tax dollars? Again, I could take up all the panel's time, and I won't by talking about this, but I think it's important to separate the reasons for wanting charter schools in the first place, and a lot of those reasons would make it worth it to have an additional 20% per student investment. Things like encouraging innovation, things like encouraging local diversity and program offerings, much like magnet schools do, charter schools do as well. In some cases, it's simply pure sorting, where parents are interested in charter schools to attend charter schools where the parents also want to apply to similar charter schools, and that might not be worth it. We might need to think better about integration programs and other forms of school assignment where charter schools don't have to be the mechanism people are using to pick their peers. And finally, another reason there's charter school growth is some parents are concerned about their voice and about quality control in schools. And there might be cheaper policies that are just as effective. Rather than spending 20% additional money per student to let them go to a charter school, maybe we need more true parent advocates. Parents are hard-pressed for time, as many of you know who currently have school-age children, don't necessarily have the time to advocate when their kids are having problems in school. And unfortunately, many of the recent policies for engaging parents have been more to suppress parent voice and parent concerns. So I'm talking about parent coordinator policies where they're basically serving as buffers, where parents have less voice. So if you want to think of cheaper and more potentially more effective ways than having the charter school growth, one policy would be, instead of investing that 20% extra per year in having this as much growth in charter schools, you could maybe spend 5 or 10% more per year and have parent advocates that can represent student and parents' needs and meet with principals and coordinate with teachers, et cetera. But again, thank you.
Thank you. Bruce.